The gun felt heavy in Samuel Whitmore's hands. He sat at the edge of his bed, gripping the cold metal with fingers that had once signed billion-dollar deals, built empires, and held his son's tiny hand. Now, they were useless. Now, they trembled. He had planned everything meticulously. The house staff had been given the weekend off. His phone was off. The lake outside his mansion in Lake Tahoe stretched into the endless dark, its surface as still as his heart had been since the accident. It had been 2 years. 2 years of silence. 2 years of waking up in a house too large, too empty, too full of ghosts. The papers called him reclusive. Some said he had lost his mind, withdrawing from the world after his wife and son were killed in a car crash. They were wrong. He hadn't lost his mind. He had simply lost the only reason he had to exist. He exhaled sharply and raised the gun. Just one movement. Just 1 second. He pressed the barrel to his temple, closed his eyes, and pain. Sudden. Searing. His chest constricted as if a vice had clamped down around his ribs. The gun clattered to the floor as his fingers curled involuntarily. His vision blurred, a wave of dizziness slamming into him so hard he nearly toppled over. His breathing turned ragged, short, panicked. A heart attack. For a fleeting moment, he almost welcomed it. A cruel irony that his body would decide to give up before he could make the decision himself. But as the pain intensified, something instinctual kicked in, an old reflex, a primal need to survive. His hand fumbled for his phone, barely managing to swipe the screen. 911. The call connected. 911. What's your emergency? The words came out strangled. Chest pain. The room spun. The floor rushed up to meet him. And then, nothing. Samuel drifted in and out of consciousness, the sterile scent of antiseptic and the distant beeping of monitors grounding him in reality. A voice. Soft but firm. Mr. Whitmore? Can you hear me? His eyelids were leaden, but he forced them open. A pair of warm brown eyes hovered above him, filled with concern. A woman. Late 20s, maybe early 30s. Auburn hair pulled back in a ponytail. Scrubs. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry. You had a heart attack, she said gently, reading his expression. You're in San Francisco, General. You were lucky. The paramedics got to you just in time. Lucky. He almost laughed. Almost. You need to rest, she continued. Your body's been through a lot. He turned his head slightly, glancing at the 4 drip attached to his arm. Tubes, machines. He hated hospitals. The last time he had been in one was after the crash. After they had told him there was nothing they could do for his wife and son. Do you want me to call someone for you? She asked. No one, he rasped. She hesitated but nodded. Okay. Something about her gaze unsettled him. It wasn't pity. He knew pity. He had seen it in the eyes of every person who whispered about him behind his back, who watched him from a distance, treating him like a tragic relic of a man. No, this was something else. A quiet understanding. You should try to sleep, she said, adjusting the blanket over him. I'll be here when you wake up. Samuel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of exhaustion pull him under. For the first time in 2 years, he wasn't entirely sure if he wanted to die anymore. The steady beeping of the heart monitor was the first thing Samuel registered when he woke. His body felt like lead, heavy and unresponsive, but his mind was clear. He was still alive. His lips pressed into a thin line. Good morning, Mr. Whitmore. The voice was familiar, warm. He turned his head slightly and saw her again, the nurse from before. Olivia Carter. She was standing beside his bed, holding a clipboard, her auburn hair now neatly braided over one shoulder. She wasn't smiling, but there was something reassuring in the way she looked at him. You gave us quite a scare last night, she said, checking his vitals. How are you feeling? Samuel exhaled through his nose. Alive. That's usually the goal. Her tone was light, but her gaze lingered on him for a beat too long, as if she was trying to read something deeper. He wasn't in the mood for conversation. His body ached, his throat was dry, and worst of all, the reason he had ended up here in the first place hadn't changed. He had wanted to die, and now he was trapped in this sterile prison, tethered to machines, surrounded by strangers who didn't know or care who he was beyond his medical chart. You suffered a myocardial infarction, Olivia continued, unfazed by his silence. Your body's under a lot of stress, but your vitals are stable. The doctor will go over everything in detail later, but for now, the most important thing is rest and hydration. She reached for a cup of water on the bedside table and handed it to him. He took it reluctantly, sipping just enough to soothe the dryness in his throat. "Is there anyone you'd like me to call?" she asked. He shook his head. "Family? Friends? No one." Something flickered in her expression. Not pity. Not the detached professionalism he expected. Something else. She didn't press further, though. Instead, she jotted something down on the clipboard and then glanced at him again. "Well, if you change your mind, just let me know," she said. "In the meantime, I'll be in and out to check on you." Samuel watched her for a moment. There was something different about her, not just her tone, but the way she carried herself. She didn't look at him the way most people did. She wasn't intimidated by his name, nor was she overly sympathetic about his condition. She was calm, steady. He wasn't sure if that made him feel better or worse. Olivia turned to leave, but then hesitated. She looked back at him, her brow slightly furrowed. "You should know," she said carefully. "It's normal to feel a lot after something like this. Anger, fear, frustration. But whatever you're feeling, you don't have to go through it alone." Her words lingered in the air between them. Samuel didn't respond. She gave a small nod, as if she hadn't expected him to, and then left the room. Alone again, Samuel closed his eyes. He should have been dead. He had wanted to be dead. And yet, here he was, his heart still beating. And for the first time in a long time, someone had looked at him like he was more than just a tragedy waiting to happen. He wasn't sure what to do with that. Nathan Caldwell's hands rested casually in the pockets of his white coat as he walked down the hallway of San Francisco General, his expression the perfect balance of confidence and control. He was used to commanding attention. Residents scrambled to impress him. Nurses adjusted their posture when he passed, and patients trusted his every word. He had built his reputation carefully, and he didn't take well to disruptions. Stopping outside room 312, he glanced at the chart before stepping inside, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the floor. The sight that greeted him made his jaw tighten. Olivia was there. She stood at the bedside, talking softly to Samuel Whitmore. The billionaire was sitting up now, looking stronger than he should after a heart attack. He was watching Olivia, not in the dazed, detached way most patients did, but with a quiet intensity that made Nathan's stomach twist. Nathan cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitmore, good to see you awake." Both Samuel and Olivia turned toward him. She took a small step back, her expression carefully neutral, but Nathan caught the flicker of something in her eyes. Surprise, maybe even guilt. Interesting. Samuel, however, showed no reaction. He simply looked at Nathan with the same cold indifference he had given the world for years. Nathan moved closer, glancing at the monitors. "Your numbers are looking better than expected. Given the severity of your heart attack, that's impressive." Samuel said nothing. Nathan had dealt with difficult patients before, but there was something about Whitmore that irritated him. Maybe it was the way he sat there, silent, as if nothing in the world could touch him. Or maybe it was the way Olivia had been looking at him before Nathan entered. "I understand you refuse to see any family," Nathan continued, pretending to check the foredrip. "But given your condition, it might be wise to have someone around. Heart attacks don't just happen to men like you. They happen because something in your life is unsustainable." Samuel's gaze didn't waver. "I appreciate the insight, doctor." His voice was steady, controlled, but I don't recall asking for it. Nathan smiled, though it was more teeth than warmth. "Just doing my job." He turned to Olivia, his voice softening ever so slightly. "Nurse Carter, a word?" She hesitated for only a second before following him into the hallway. Nathan closed the door behind them, then leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Since when are you personally tending to Samuel Whitmore?" Olivia crossed her arms. "I was assigned to his case. You know how rotations work, Nathan. You spend a lot of time in there." "Because he's my patient." Nathan studied her. He had known Olivia long enough to recognize when she was deflecting. She was always so composed, so infuriatingly ethical, but there was something different now, an edge of tension beneath her usual professionalism. His fingers brushed her wrist, gentle but firm. "You should be careful with him, Olivia. He's not just another patient." She tensed. "And what exactly do you mean by that?" Nathan's grip tightened slightly before he let go. "You know what I mean." He straightened, giving her a measured look. "We have dinner with the hospital board this weekend. I assume you'll be ready." The shift in subject was deliberate, a reminder. Her jaw tightened. "Of course." "Good." Nathan leaned in, lowering his voice again. You're a great nurse. But don't forget what we're building here, Olivia. People are watching. Don't give them a reason to talk." Without waiting for a response, he walked away, leaving her standing there, fists clenched at her sides. Inside the hospital room, Samuel Whitmore stared at the door Olivia had just walked through, his fingers absently tracing the edge of the hospital blanket. He might not have known Nathan Caldwell personally, but he recognized a man like that when he saw one. And he didn't like what he saw. Samuel didn't sleep that night. He sat in the sterile dimness of his hospital room, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic beeping of the machines that tethered him to life. He should have been relieved that his body hadn't betrayed him again, but all he felt was a hollow sort of exhaustion. He wasn't sure why Olivia Carter lingered in his thoughts. She was just a nurse, one of dozens who had probably walked in and out of this room over the last 24 hours. But something about her was different. The way she spoke to him like he was a person, not a tragedy. The way she didn't flinch at his silence or his sharp edges. And then there was the way Nathan Caldwell had spoken to her in the hallway. Samuel had spent years negotiating with men like Caldwell, men who smiled just enough to mask their intentions, who delivered threats wrapped in compliments. He knew what power looked like when it was being wielded, and he had seen it in the way Caldwell touched her wrist, in the way Olivia's shoulders had stiffened beneath his words. It wasn't his problem, and yet, it bothered him more than it should. The morning brought a familiar face. Olivia stepped into the room with a fresh chart in her hands, her expression calm, but not indifferent. She had a way of looking at people as if she actually saw them, and Samuel wasn't sure he liked that. "You look like you didn't sleep," she observed, setting the clipboard down. Samuel let out a quiet huff. "Hospitals aren't exactly designed for comfort." She smirked. "No, but the sheets are top of the line, I promise." For a brief moment, he thought she might actually make him laugh. But the feeling passed quickly, and the silence that followed was heavier than before. Olivia adjusted the foredrip, her fingers light but practiced. "You should try to rest today," she said. "The doctor wants to monitor your vitals before deciding on the next steps. But from what I've seen, you're improving." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Why bother? We both know I wasn't planning on sticking around much longer." Olivia stilled, but only for a second. When she turned to face him fully, her expression was unreadable. "Is that why you were alone when the paramedics found you?" she asked. He didn't answer. "You don't have to tell me," she continued, softer now. "But I've worked here long enough to recognize when someone's given up." Samuel met her gaze. "And what exactly do you think you can do about that, Nurse Carter?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But I do know that people don't usually want to die. They just don't want to feel like this anymore." The words hit harder than he wanted to admit. Olivia sighed, shaking her head. "Sorry, that was probably too much before breakfast." Samuel studied her for a moment. "You talk to all your patients like this?" "Only the difficult ones." For the first time in what felt like years, something close to amusement flickered inside him. It wasn't much, but it was there. She checked his chart one last time, then turned to leave. But just as she reached the door, he spoke again. "Caldwell," he said. She stopped. "What's he to you?" Olivia hesitated. She turned slightly, just enough for him to see the careful way she schooled her features. "He's my fiancé." Samuel hadn't expected the answer to bother him, but it did. "Then why do you look like you just swallowed glass saying that?" Her fingers tightened around the clipboard. "You should rest, Mr. Whitmore." And with that, she walked out, leaving Samuel with more questions than before. But one thing was certain. Olivia Carter wasn't happy, and for some reason, that mattered. Samuel didn't believe in fate. He believed in numbers, in logic, in choices that led to consequences. The universe didn't have a grand design. People made their own luck, and they paid for their own mistakes. But the fact that Olivia Carter kept showing up in his life, that felt like something else. He hadn't seen her all afternoon. Other nurses had come and gone, but none of them were her. It shouldn't have mattered. He shouldn't have noticed. Yet, when the door finally opened and she stepped in, Samuel felt something shift. "You're still here," he murmured, watching her move around the room with practiced ease. "Of course I'm still here," she replied, setting a small tray down beside his bed. "You're my patient." "That's not what I meant." She paused, just for a second, before reaching for the foredrip. "Your vitals are looking better. You might be able to go home in a couple of days, depending on how your next tests go." Samuel scoffed. Home. It was just a word, but it felt foreign now. His house in Lake Tahoe wasn't a home. It was a mausoleum, a place where memories clung to the walls like dust. Olivia seemed to pick up on his thoughts because she glanced at him then, her expression unreadable. "Do you live alone?" Samuel hesitated. "I used to have a family." It was the first time he had said it aloud in a long time. Olivia didn't push for details, didn't ask the kind of invasive questions people usually did when they found out he was that Samuel Whitmore. Instead, she nodded, as if she understood more than she let on. Silence settled between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. For a moment, it was just the quiet hum of the machines and the distant sound of hospital life outside the door. Then, Olivia did something unexpected. She sat down, not just in the usual, clinical way that nurses did when they were charting notes, but like she wanted to be there, like she wasn't in a hurry to leave. "How long have you been engaged to Caldwell?" Samuel asked before he could stop himself. Olivia's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. "A while." "That's not an answer." She exhaled, glancing down at her hands. 2 years. Samuel arched a brow. "And how many of those years have you actually wanted to marry him?" Olivia's head snapped up, a mixture of surprise and irritation crossing her face. "Excuse me." He didn't back down. "You don't look at him like someone who's in love." She bristled. "And how exactly would you know that?" Samuel tilted his head slightly. "Because I know what it looks like to not love someone." Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. It was as if he had peeled back something raw, something she wasn't ready to confront. She looked away, focusing on a non-existent spot on the floor. "It's complicated," she said finally. Samuel leaned back against the pillows. "It always is." The door to the room opened suddenly, and both of them turned as Nathan Caldwell stepped in. His gaze immediately locked onto Olivia. "There you are," Nathan said smoothly, walking toward her. "I've been looking for you." Olivia's posture straightened, her professional mask sliding into place. "I was just checking on Mr. Whitmore's vitals." Nathan's smile didn't reach his eyes as he turned his attention to Samuel. "You're in good hands, then. Olivia is one of the best nurses in this hospital." Samuel didn't miss the possessiveness in the way he said her name. Olivia's fingers curled slightly against the fabric of her scrubs. "I was just finishing up." Nathan reached out, brushing his hand against her lower back in a way that might have looked casual to anyone else. But to Samuel, it looked like a warning. He had seen that kind of touch before, the kind designed to remind someone who they belonged to. Samuel's fingers clenched beneath the blanket. Nathan turned back to him. "I hear you'll be discharged soon." "That's good news." Samuel met his gaze evenly. "We'll see." Nathan gave a tight smile before shifting his attention back to Olivia. "You're still coming to dinner tomorrow, right? The board is expecting us." Olivia hesitated. "Of course." "Good." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough that Samuel almost didn't hear it. "Don't be late." Then, without another word, he left. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving the room heavier than before. Olivia let out a slow breath, her fingers gripping the edge of the tray she had brought in earlier. Samuel watched her carefully. "That guy's a real piece of work, isn't he?" She shot him a sharp look. "You don't know him." "I know men like him." Olivia's jaw tightened. "Nathan is complicated. He's ambitious. And yes, he can be controlling sometimes. But, Samuel pressed. Her throat worked around the word she couldn't seem to say. He shook his head. "You don't owe me an explanation. But if you have to keep convincing yourself that someone is good for you, they probably aren't." She let out a humorless laugh. "And you're suddenly an expert on relationships?" "No," Samuel admitted. "But I know what it's like to be trapped in something you don't know how to escape." Olivia looked at him then, really looked at him. And for the first time, he thought she might actually see him. Not as Samuel Whitmore, the broken billionaire, but as someone who understood. The air between them crackled with something unspoken, something they weren't ready to name. Finally, Olivia pushed back from the chair. "I should go." Samuel didn't stop her. But as she reached the door, he spoke again. "If you ever decide you want out," he said quietly, "you don't have to do it alone." She froze. For a second, he thought she might turn back, that she might say something, acknowledge what was happening between them. But then, she was gone, and Samuel was left with the unsettling realization that for the first time in years, he cared about something again. Or rather, someone. The restaurant was extravagant. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over white linen-covered tables, and the low hum of conversation mixed with the delicate clinking of silverware against china. Olivia sat beside Nathan, her posture straight, her hands folded in her lap as the hospital board members chatted around them. She had done this before, countless times, smiling when expected, nodding in the right places, pretending to be the polished, elegant woman Nathan needed by his side. But tonight felt different. Because tonight, her mind was still in a hospital room with a man who saw right through her. Samuel Whitmore's words wouldn't leave her alone. Tell me you love him. Tell me he makes you feel safe. She had wanted to say yes. She had wanted to mean it. But she couldn't. Olivia. Nathan's voice snapped her back to the present. She turned to him, finding his sharp blue eyes studying her. You're quiet. Just tired, she said smoothly, taking a sip of her wine to mask the tightness in her throat. Nathan hummed, unconvinced. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear. You've been distracted lately. I've been working a lot. Or maybe you've been spending too much time with your patients. Olivia's grip on her glass tightened. She knew where this was going. Nathan wasn't stupid. He had noticed her lingering in Samuel's room longer than necessary. He had noticed the shift in her. And Nathan never liked feeling like he wasn't in control. You know how important these dinners are, he continued, his voice smooth but edged with something sharper. We have to maintain appearances. People are watching. Olivia forced a smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. Of course. Nathan held her gaze for a long moment before finally nodding, satisfied. He returned his attention to the conversation at the table, slipping effortlessly back into his polished, charming persona. But Olivia barely heard a word. Her thoughts were still tangled in the memory of a man who, in just a few words, had made her question everything. By the time they got back to Nathan's apartment, Olivia's head was pounding. She had barely stepped inside when she felt his hand close around her wrist. Olivia. She turned, her heart skipping a beat at the look on his face. Nathan wasn't smiling anymore. You've been different, he said. She swallowed. I don't know what you mean. His grip tightened, just enough to make her pulse spike. I think you do. A chill ran down her spine. She had seen Nathan angry before, but it was always controlled, always measured. He wasn't the kind of man who raised his voice. He didn't need to. His words were sharp enough to cut without ever having to shout. You spend too much time with Whitmore, he said, his voice low, calculated. Olivia forced herself to stay calm. He's my patient. Nathan's expression didn't change. And is that all he is? She hated that she hesitated. Even for a second. Nathan saw it. His fingers brushed over her wrist, deceptively gentle now, but the warning in his touch was clear. I've worked too hard for this life, Olivia. We've worked too hard. I won't let someone like him ruin it. Her stomach twisted. Do you understand? Nathan murmured. She nodded slowly, because it was the only answer he would accept. Nathan finally released her, smoothing down his shirt as if nothing had happened. Good. Then he walked away, leaving Olivia standing there, her pulse hammering in her ears. She pressed a hand to her chest, trying to steady her breathing. She needed to get out. But where would she go? There was only one place that came to mind. And before she could stop herself, she was already reaching for her keys. Samuel wasn't expecting company. The hospital had released him earlier that afternoon, and now he was back in the empty expanse of his mansion, staring at the same walls he had once planned to die within. He had poured himself a drink, but it sat untouched on the table beside him. He wasn't sure why he felt restless. Or maybe he did, because even though he had left the hospital, part of him had expected Olivia Carter to show up one last time. She hadn't, and it shouldn't have bothered him. But it did. Then, as if the universe had heard his thoughts, there was a knock at his front door. Samuel frowned. No one came here. Not without an invitation. He pushed himself up, moving carefully, his body still adjusting to the aftermath of his heart attack. He made his way through the dimly lit house and pulled open the door. Olivia stood on his doorstep. Her eyes were wide, her breath uneven, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if she was holding something in. Samuel's stomach tightened. Olivia, he said, his voice quieter than he intended. She swallowed hard, looking up at him. I didn't know where else to go. And just like that, everything changed. Samuel didn't speak right away. He simply stood there, watching Olivia on his doorstep, the night air pressing in around them. She was trembling, not from the cold, but from something deeper, something that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the look in her eyes. She had been holding it together all night. He could see it now, in the tightness of her shoulders, in the way her fingers dug into the fabric of her sleeves. She had kept it together for everyone else, but now, here in front of him, she was unraveling. Samuel exhaled slowly and stepped aside. "Come in." Olivia hesitated, just for a second. Then she crossed the threshold. The house was dark, but Samuel didn't bother turning on the lights. He led her to the living room, where the glow from the fireplace cast long shadows against the walls. He didn't offer her a drink, didn't press her for answers. He just waited. She sat down on the edge of the couch, her posture too rigid, her hands clasped together so tightly that her knuckles were white. "Did he hurt you?" Samuel asked, his voice quiet but firm. Olivia shook her head immediately. "No, not physically." Samuel's jaw clenched. "Not physically." That didn't mean she was okay. She let out a shaky breath and leaned forward, burying her face in her hands. "I don't know what I'm doing," she admitted. Samuel leaned against the armrest of the chair across from her, watching her carefully. "Then why are you here?" She lifted her head, meeting his gaze. "Because I needed to be." That shouldn't have affected him the way it did. But it did. Samuel ran a hand over his face. He had told her once that she didn't have to go through this alone. He had meant it. But he hadn't expected her to show up here, in his house, in the middle of the night, looking like a woman standing at the edge of a decision she wasn't ready to make. He should tell her to go home. He should tell her to be smart, to think things through, to avoid making choices in the heat of the moment that she might regret later. But he didn't. Instead, he said, "Stay as long as you need." And that was how it started. Not with a kiss, not with a confession, but with a quiet understanding between two people who were both too tired to pretend anymore. The minutes stretched into an hour. Olivia didn't move from the couch, and Samuel didn't push her to. He let the silence settle between them, waiting to see if she would speak first. Finally, she did. "I don't know who I am anymore," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. I used to be so sure." Samuel leaned forward slightly. "And now, I feel like I've spent the last 2 years becoming someone I don't recognize." She exhaled, shaking her head. "Nathan was the safe choice. He had a plan, and I fit into it. And for a while, I convinced myself that was enough." Samuel's fingers curled slightly against his knee. "And now?" he asked again. Her eyes met his. "And now, I think I made a mistake." Samuel's throat tightened. "Because of me?" She hesitated. Then, slowly, she shook her head. "No, because of me." That was the moment he knew. This wasn't about him. It never had been. Olivia hadn't walked away from Nathan for Samuel. She had walked away because she had finally realized she needed to. He should be relieved. But for some reason, it felt like something heavier was settling in his chest. "Samuel," she said softly. He looked up. Her hands were trembling slightly. She placed them in her lap, as if trying to steady herself. "I can't do this." His chest tightened. "Do what?" "This." She gestured between them, her expression pained. "I can't go from one complicated situation to another. I need to figure out who I am before I can." She trailed off, biting her lip. Before she could what? Before she could want him? Before she could allow herself to feel whatever this was between them? Samuel forced himself to nod. "I understand." Because he did. Because the last thing she needed right now was someone else telling her who she should be. She exhaled, looking almost relieved. I need time." "Then take it," he said, his voice steady even as something inside him twisted. She studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she stood up. Samuel watched as she walked toward the door, her steps hesitant but sure. She reached for the handle, but before she could turn it, she glanced back at him. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Don't be." She hesitated again. Then, with a final nod, she stepped outside. The door clicked shut behind her, and Samuel sat there, staring at the empty space where she had been. He had told her to take her time, but what he hadn't said, what he hadn't let himself admit, was that he didn't know if he had the patience to wait. Olivia didn't go home that night. She couldn't. Instead, she drove aimlessly through the darkened streets of San Francisco, her fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles ached. The city blurred past her in streaks of neon and shadow, but she barely registered it. All she could think about was the way Samuel had looked at her when she left. The way he had let her go, without protest, without guilt. She should feel relieved. Instead, she felt hollow. When she finally pulled over, she found herself in front of an old diner, one she hadn't been to in years. It was the kind of place that never changed, the kind where the coffee was always a little burnt, and the waitresses had worked there long enough to know the names of regulars by heart. She slid into a booth near the window, wrapping her hands around a cup of coffee she didn't plan on drinking. Rough night. The voice was familiar. She looked up and found herself staring at Riley Jensen, her oldest friend. Riley hadn't changed much since their nursing school days. Her blonde hair was still cut short in a way that suited her sharp features, and her blue eyes were still filled with the kind of insight that made it impossible to lie to her. Olivia swallowed hard. Something like that. Riley slid into the booth across from her. Tell me. Olivia hesitated. She hadn't told anyone about Samuel. She hadn't told anyone about the way things had been unraveling with Nathan for months. But tonight, she was too tired to hold it in. I left Nathan, she said quietly. Riley didn't look surprised. Good. Olivia let out a shaky breath. It doesn't feel good. Riley tilted her head. Because you miss him? No. Olivia shook her head immediately. Because I don't know who I am without him. Riley sighed, leaning back. Liv, you were never just Nathan's fiancée. You were never just some accessory to his life, no matter how much he wanted you to be. Olivia pressed her fingers to her temples. It's not that simple, isn't it? Riley asked. What changed? Olivia hesitated. Samuel Whitmore. Riley blinked. Then, very slowly, she smirked. The billionaire? That's Samuel Whitmore. Olivia exhaled. It's not like that. Are you sure? Riley's eyes gleamed. Olivia hesitated too long. Riley let out a low whistle. Wow. Okay. Didn't see that coming. Olivia groaned, rubbing her hands over her face. I don't know what's happening. That's the problem. Riley sobered, studying her carefully. But you feel something, don't you? Olivia swallowed. Yeah, I do. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Riley leaned forward, her expression serious. Liv, I don't know what's going on between you two. But I do know this. Nathan is not the kind of man who lets things go easily. And if he thinks Samuel is the reason you left, you need to be careful. A shiver ran down Olivia's spine. Because deep down, she knew Riley was right. Nathan wasn't done with her. And that terrified her more than she wanted to admit. Nathan Caldwell was not a man accustomed to losing. He sat in his office, fingers steepled together, staring at the unopened bottle of whiskey on his desk. The city skyline stretched out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, but he barely noticed it. Olivia was gone. She hadn't come home. She hadn't answered his calls. And worse than anything, she had walked away without looking back. Nathan clenched his jaw. This wasn't over. Olivia didn't get to decide when things ended. He had spent 2 years building a future with her, molding her into the perfect partner, the perfect asset. She had been compliant, reliable, a woman who knew her place. Until now. And Nathan had a very strong suspicion about why. Samuel Whitmore. The billionaire had barely been conscious for a week before Olivia started acting differently. Nathan had noticed it in the way she lingered too long in Whitmore's room, in the way she had hesitated when Nathan confronted her. She was slipping away, and it was because of him. Nathan leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He needed to fix this. He needed Olivia back where she belonged. And if Samuel Whitmore was in the way, then he'd just have to be removed. Samuel had spent most of his life making enemies. It was the cost of doing business, of being the kind of man who built an empire with his own hands. He had learned a long time ago that power attracted resentment, and he had never lost sleep over it. But this was different, because this wasn't about business. This was about Olivia, and Samuel knew, deep in his gut, that Nathan Caldwell wasn't done with her. He had seen men like Nathan before, men who smiled through clenched teeth, who spoke in measured words, but always carried the undercurrent of something darker beneath the surface. Men who didn't let go. Samuel sat in his study, his whiskey untouched, his fingers drumming lightly against the armrest of his chair. He should walk away. He should let Olivia handle her own life, her own choices. But he couldn't, because Olivia Carter had looked at him like he was worth saving. And Samuel Whitmore didn't take that lightly. So if Nathan Caldwell wanted to make this a fight, then so be it. Samuel had never been one to lose, and he wasn't about to start now. Olivia felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her as she stepped into her apartment. She had barely been home since leaving Nathan. She had spent the last few nights at Riley's place, using work as an excuse to avoid facing the silence of an empty home. But now, as she locked the door behind her, she couldn't ignore the eerie stillness. Everything was exactly as she had left it. The framed photos on the walls, the carefully arranged books on the coffee table, the neatly folded blanket draped over the couch. It looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. Because now she knew she wouldn't be sharing this space with Nathan anymore. She should feel relieved. Instead, unease settled in her chest like a stone. She dropped her bag by the door and moved toward the kitchen, flipping on the lights. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound as she poured herself a glass of water, trying to shake the lingering tension in her spine. Then she noticed it. The smallest thing, barely even noticeable. The picture frame on the counter, the one that used to hold a photo of her and Nathan at a hospital gala, was face down. Her pulse skipped. Had she knocked it over before she left? She couldn't remember. A sharp knock at the door made her jump. She turned slowly, her fingers tightening around the glass in her hand. Another knock, louder this time. She forced herself to breathe, to move toward the door even as something deep inside her screamed at her to run. She hesitated before unlocking it, her heart pounding. And then she opened it. Nathan stood there, dressed impeccably as always, his suit tailored to perfection, his posture relaxed, but his eyes told a different story. Something dark, something possessive. Olivia's grip on the door tightened. "What are you doing here?" Nathan smiled, but it was forced. "You weren't answering my calls." She swallowed. "There's a reason for that." His jaw tensed, just for a second, before he let out a soft chuckle. "Olivia, come on. This is ridiculous. You're upset, I get it. But running away like this? Avoiding me?" He shook his head. "That's not you." She took a step back. "Maybe you don't know me as well as you think." Nathan's expression didn't change, but the air between them grew colder. "That's not true. We've built a life together. You don't just throw something like that away." Olivia lifted her chin. "I already did." Silence. For a moment, she thought, hoped, he might just leave, that he might see the finality in her eyes and walk away. But Nathan Caldwell had never been the kind of man to accept defeat. His gaze sharpened. "Is this about him?" Her stomach twisted. "Nathan." "Because if it is," he interrupted smoothly, stepping inside before she could stop him, "then I have to warn you. Olivia, Samuel Whitmore is not the man you think he is." Her breath caught. "You don't know him." Nathan laughed, low and humorless. "And you do?" She didn't answer. Nathan exhaled, shaking his head like he was disappointed. "You're making a mistake." Olivia's hands curled into fists. "If I am, it's mine to make." Nathan studied her for a long moment. Then, just as quickly as he had let his anger slip, he was composed again. He smiled. "All right," he said smoothly. "I won't fight you on this." Something in his tone made her uneasy. Nathan never didn't fight. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a key. Her key. He set it on the entryway table. "I'll respect your space," he said, his voice calm. "But just remember, I always have your best interests at heart." She wanted to tell him to leave, to slam the door in his face. But she knew better, so she forced herself to nod. Nathan stepped past her, lingering for just a second before walking out. The door clicked shut, and Olivia locked it. Then she leaned against the wall, pressing a shaking hand to her mouth. Nathan wasn't done. She could feel it. Samuel wasn't a man who enjoyed waiting, especially not when it came to people he gave a damn about. Which was why, when Olivia finally called him the next morning, he answered on the first ring. "Olivia," he said, his voice steady. There was silence on the other end, just for a beat. Then, "I need to see you." Samuel exhaled. "Where are you? Can you meet me somewhere?" I don't want to do this over the phone." That was all he needed to hear. "Text me the address," he said. He was already reaching for his keys. The cafe Olivia had chosen was small, tucked into a quiet street away from the usual morning rush. Samuel spotted her immediately. She was sitting by the window, fingers curled around a cup of coffee, staring down at the table like she was trying to gather the right words. She looked tired and worried. Samuel slid into the seat across from her. "Tell me what happened." Olivia lifted her eyes to his, and for a moment, she didn't say anything. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Nathan came to my apartment last night." Samuel's grip tightened on the edge of the table. "Did he touch you?" She shook her head. "No, but he made it clear he's not letting this go." Samuel's jaw locked. "What exactly did he say?" She hesitated. Then, quietly, that he has my best interests at heart. Samuel let out a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm, because he knew what men like Nathan meant when they said things like that. It was a warning, a promise. You don't owe him anything, Samuel said, his voice measured. Olivia let out a shaky breath. I know, but that doesn't mean he's going to just let me go. Samuel leaned forward. Then I'll make him. Olivia's eyes widened slightly. Samuel, I'm not going to let him hurt you, he said firmly. She swallowed, looking down at her hands. I don't want this to turn into something worse. Samuel's expression darkened. It already has. Because this wasn't just about Olivia leaving Nathan. This was about control. And Nathan Caldwell didn't like losing control. Samuel reached across the table, covering her hand with his. You're not alone in this, he said quietly. Olivia exhaled, her fingers tightening around his just slightly. For the first time in a long time, she believed him. But deep down, she knew Nathan wasn't done. And the worst was yet to come. Samuel wasn't a man prone to violence. He had built his empire with intelligence, not brute force. He had learned early on that power wasn't about who threw the first punch. It was about who controlled the room, the conversation, the outcome. But Nathan Caldwell wasn't the kind of man who operated within the boundaries of control that Samuel respected. Nathan was a man who used leverage, manipulation, and fear. And Samuel had seen what happened when men like that felt power slipping through their fingers. As he sat across from Olivia in the quiet cafe, watching her fingers tremble slightly as she wrapped them around her coffee cup, he made a silent vow. Nathan wasn't going to win this. And Samuel wasn't going to let Olivia fight this battle alone. She let out a slow breath and pulled her hand away, rubbing her arms as if she were trying to shake off a cold that had settled deep into her bones. I don't know what to do, Samuel. His eyes stayed locked on hers. Then let me help you. She gave him a weary look. How? You can't stay in that apartment, he said simply. Not if he still has a key. Her lips pressed together, the exhaustion evident in her face. I changed the locks. That won't stop him, Samuel said bluntly. You know that. She did. She didn't want to admit it, but she did. Nathan was the kind of man who saw obstacles as temporary inconveniences. A changed lock wouldn't stop him. If anything, it would only provoke him further. She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. And what's my other option? Running? Samuel's gaze darkened. It's not running if you're protecting yourself. She lifted her eyes, studying him. And where exactly do you think I should go? The answer was immediate. With me. Silence. A charged, heavy silence that stretched between them, thick enough to drown in. You're serious? She whispered. Samuel leaned forward slightly. You need time to figure out your next move. My place is safe, and I won't let anything happen to you. Her throat tightened. I can't ask you to do that. You didn't, he said simply. I offered. Olivia exhaled shakily, rubbing a hand over her face. Every logical part of her knew this was dangerous. That moving into Samuel Whitmore's world, even temporarily, would complicate everything. But Nathan wasn't going to back down. And Samuel was right. She wasn't safe. Her fingers curled into fists beneath the table. Okay, she said quietly. Samuel nodded once. Pack a bag. I'll pick you up after your shift. She swallowed hard, nodding in return. Neither of them said it out loud. But they both knew. This was the moment everything changed. Nathan was losing control. And he hated it. He sat in his office, his fingers clenched into fists as he listened to the report over the phone. She hasn't been back to the apartment since last night, his private investigator told him. But she met Whitmore at a cafe this morning. They talked for a while, then left separately. Nathan's jaw tightened. And she's still keeping her distance from you, the man said carefully. Nathan exhaled slowly through his nose. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Olivia belonged to him. She had been perfectly molded, perfectly trained for the life he had built. And then Whitmore had ruined it. His fingers tapped against the desk as he considered his next move. He wasn't going to lose her. Not to him. Not to anyone. Keep watching her, he ordered. And find out exactly where Whitmore is keeping her. He ended the call before the investigator could respond. Then, slowly, a smile curled across his lips. This wasn't over. Not even close. Olivia had never seen Samuel's house in the daylight. She had only been there once before, late at night, when the shadows had softened the edges of the mansion, making it feel less imposing. But now, as he pulled the car into the long driveway, she realized just how isolated it was. The property stretched wide, acres of land separating it from the rest of the world. The lake glistened just beyond the house, its surface reflecting the fading sunlight. It was beautiful, and yet it still felt like a prison. Samuel parked the car and glanced at her. "You okay?" She forced a small smile. "I don't know." He didn't press her for more. Instead, he grabbed her bag from the back seat and led her inside. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that came from too much space and not enough life to fill it. Samuel set her bag down near the staircase. "Guest room is upstairs, second door on the left. You can take as much time as you need to settle in." She nodded, hesitating. "Thank you." His gaze softened slightly. "You don't have to thank me, Olivia." She swallowed past the lump in her throat and turned toward the stairs. But before she could take a step, there was a sharp, abrupt knock at the front door. Samuel's body tensed immediately. Olivia froze. A second knock, louder this time. Samuel stepped in front of her, his posture rigid. "Go upstairs," he murmured. Her pulse spiked. "Samuel, now." His voice left no room for argument. She hesitated for only a second before obeying, her heart hammering as she moved quickly up the stairs. She barely reached the top when she heard Samuel open the door. And then, "Nathan," Samuel said coldly. Olivia's breath caught. She pressed herself against the wall, out of sight, her nails digging into her palms. Nathan was here, and suddenly, she wasn't sure if coming to Samuel's house had been a mistake. Because this was it. The moment everything would come crashing down. Samuel stood in the doorway, his broad frame a wall between Nathan and the sanctuary of the house. The tension in the air was so thick it felt as though the world had stopped, leaving only the two men standing in the half-shadow of the porch. The silence stretched long and tight between them, a taut wire threatening to snap. Nathan wore his composure like a finely tailored suit. His hands rested casually in the pockets of his overcoat, his lips pulled into a polite, almost pleasant curve. But Samuel could see beyond the mask. Nathan's eyes betrayed him, cold, sharp, a serpent's gaze just before the strike. "Nice place," Nathan said, his voice smooth, unbothered. His eyes slid past Samuel, trying to peer into the dim foyer beyond. "I didn't realize you and Olivia had gotten so close." Samuel remained still, blocking the view, his hand gripping the doorframe. "What do you want, Nathan?" Nathan exhaled softly through his nose, a sound that might have been mistaken for amusement. "Now, is that any way to greet a guest?" "You're not a guest," Samuel replied, his tone as hard as stone. "And you're wasting your time." Nathan's expression didn't falter, but the shadows in his eyes darkened. "I'd like to speak with Olivia. She doesn't want to see you." A slight tilt of Nathan's head, a gesture that might seem casual if not for the dangerous undertone. "You're awfully invested in something that isn't your business." Samuel's fingers tightened, his knuckles turning white. Every instinct told him to throw Nathan off his property, to end this confrontation with force. But that was exactly what Nathan wanted, to provoke him, to turn the situation to his advantage. "I'm invested because you made it my business," Samuel said, his voice low and even. "You did that when she showed up at my door afraid of you." Nathan's lips pressed into a thin line. The controlled mask slipped, just for a moment, revealing the anger simmering beneath. "She's confused," he said, the words too measured. "And you? You're just the convenient distraction." The accusation hung in the air, bitter and sharp. Samuel could feel the weight of it, the insinuation that whatever connection he had with Olivia was nothing more than an escape for her, a temporary defiance against Nathan's control. But Samuel knew better. He leaned against the doorframe, forcing a casualness he didn't feel. "I don't think she's confused at all. I think, for the first time in a long while, she finally sees you for what you are." Nathan's composure cracked. His smile faded, the thin veneer of civility giving way to something far uglier. Samuel didn't miss the subtle twitch of Nathan's fingers, the tightening of his jaw. For the first time since he arrived, Nathan looked rattled. "You should leave," Samuel said, his voice steady, unyielding. Nathan remained rooted to the spot, a statue of resentment and barely contained fury. He stood there, every muscle in his body coiled tight, as if he were weighing the consequences of his next move. Slowly, he took a step back, his shoes crunching softly against the gravel. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and filled with a promise of retribution. Samuel didn't break eye contact. It is for her. A muscle ticked in Nathan's jaw. His lips parted as if he might say more, but instead, he drew in a long breath and released it through his nose. His expression smoothed over, the predator pulling its mask back on. We'll see. He turned sharply, his movements precise and controlled. He walked back to his car with the steady confidence of a man who believed he would always have the last word. His black sedan sat at the end of the driveway, a dark silhouette against the fading light. Samuel stood on the porch, unmoving, until Nathan climbed into the driver's seat and the engine purred to life. The taillights glowed red as the car eased down the long, winding road, finally disappearing around a bend. The moment the vehicle vanished, the tension that had coiled around Samuel's chest began to unravel, but only slightly. He shut the door firmly, the sound echoing through the quiet house. The click of the lock felt like the only barrier between them and whatever threat Nathan had just left lingering in the air. The silence was deafening. The house, which had felt so cavernous and empty before, now seemed to hold its breath along with him. Samuel turned slowly, his eyes adjusting to the dim light of the foyer. Olivia stood on the staircase, halfway down, her hands gripping the railing as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her knuckles were white, her fingers taut against the wood. She had been listening, every word of the exchange sinking into her like stones into deep water. Her face was pale, her lips parted as she tried to draw in steady breaths. She looked like someone on the edge of a precipice, unsure whether to step back or let go. "He's gone," Samuel said, his voice softer now, the hard edges smoothed by concern. Olivia didn't move. Her breath came in uneven gasps, her chest rising and falling too quickly. Not for long. The weight of her fear hit him hard. It was a tangible thing, filling the room with its cold, suffocating presence. Samuel's fingers curled into fists at his sides, the remnants of his anger still simmering beneath the surface. "He doesn't get to control you anymore, Olivia." She let out a laugh, hollow, brittle. She released the banister, running both hands through her hair as if trying to physically shake off the fear. "You don't know him, Samuel. You don't know what he's capable of." Samuel closed the distance between them, his steps measured, careful. He reached out but stopped short, his hands hovering near hers without touching. "Then tell me," he urged, his voice gentle but insistent. Her hesitation was palpable. She drew in a shaky breath, and for a moment, he thought she might turn away, shut him out. But then, the dam broke. Nathan isn't just controlling. He's calculated. He doesn't make threats he can't back up. He doesn't yell. He doesn't hit. But he makes it clear that if you step out of line, you'll regret it. Her voice wavered, each word laced with the weight of old wounds. Samuel's jaw clenched so tightly he thought it might crack. "Has he hurt you before?" She shook her head, but her voice was a whisper. "Not physically, but he's hurt you." Samuel pressed, his tone unyielding. Her shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of her. She nodded, a small, broken gesture. The rage that burned through Samuel was a slow, simmering heat. He had known anger before, but this was different. This wasn't about business, or pride, or power. This was about her. About the woman standing before him, who had been made to believe she was small and powerless. He reached out, his fingers brushing over hers, gentle, grounding. "You're not alone in this," he said, his voice a promise. "I'm not going to let him touch you." A shudder ran through her, but she didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers tightened around his, clinging to the quiet strength he offered. They stood like that for a long moment, suspended in the fragile space between fear and hope. And in that silence, with the shadows of Nathan's threats still looming over them, Samuel made another vow. Nathan Caldwell would not win. Not this time. Not ever. Samuel barely slept. He spent most of the night seated in the leather chair near the window, watching the tree-lined driveway of his estate in near total silence. His phone rested on the table beside him, untouched except for the one time he had picked it up to check the security feeds. Everything was still, but stillness didn't mean safety, not when a man like Nathan Caldwell was involved. Down the hall, Olivia slept fitfully. He had checked on her once, just to be sure she was okay. She had left the door cracked open, whether by accident or design, he wasn't sure. But the sight of her curled up beneath the thick comforter, her brow furrowed even in sleep, had made something deep in Samuel's chest twist uncomfortably. She wasn't okay. She had spent so much time convincing herself that she was strong enough to handle Nathan, strong enough to endure whatever he threw her way, but Samuel could see the weight of it all bearing down on her. And the worst part was, she had been ready to carry it alone. That wouldn't happen anymore. Morning came too soon. Samuel rose early, showered, and was halfway through making coffee when he heard footsteps behind him. Olivia stood in the doorway. Wrapped in a sweatshirt she must have pulled from her bag, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Her hair was still messy from sleep, but her eyes were sharp, alert, despite the exhaustion lingering beneath them. "Did you sleep?" she asked, her voice quiet. Samuel poured a second cup of coffee and set it on the counter near her. "Did you?" She hesitated, then sighed as she stepped forward to take the mug. "Not really." He leaned against the counter, watching her as she wrapped her fingers around the ceramic. She took a sip, closing her eyes for a brief moment, as if savoring the warmth. Then, she looked at him. He's not going to stop. Samuel had expected her to say it, but hearing it aloud still sent a wave of irritation rolling through him. "No, he's not," he admitted. She let out a slow breath, setting her cup down. "I can't live like this, Samuel. I don't want to keep looking over my shoulder, wondering when he's going to try something else." "Then we end it," Samuel said simply. She blinked. "What?" "We stop waiting," he clarified. "Nathan thrives on control. He wants you scared. He wants you to believe that he's always a step ahead, that you'll never be free of him. So we don't play his game. We take control away from him." Olivia stared at him, something wary flickering in her eyes. "And how do we do that?" Samuel set his coffee down and met her gaze with quiet determination. "We expose him." A beat of silence. Olivia inhaled sharply. "You don't know what you're saying." "Yes, I do." Her grip on the mug tightened. "Samuel, Nathan isn't just some jealous ex. He's powerful. He has connections, resources. If we push him, if we make this public, he'll lose," Samuel cut in. She shook her head. "You don't know that." "Yes, I do," Samuel repeated, his voice firm. "Because men like Nathan only stay in power as long as no one fights back. As long as the people around them stay quiet." Olivia swallowed hard, her fingers trembling slightly as she set her coffee down. "Olivia," he said, stepping closer. "What is he hiding?" She hesitated. "I know there's something," Samuel continued. "Something bigger than just the way he treated you." She opened her mouth as if to deny it, but then, slowly, her shoulders slumped. "There are things," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Things I've seen, things I've ignored because I didn't think I could do anything about them." "Tell me," Samuel urged gently. She closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself before looking back at him. "Money laundering. He's used hospital funds for personal investments. He's forged patient records to cover up malpractice incidents. I never had proof, but I knew. I always knew." Samuel exhaled, running a hand over his jaw. "That's enough. We can use that." Olivia let out a humorless laugh. "And what? Just go to the police? What if they don't believe me?" "They will," Samuel said. "And if they don't, I'll make them." She looked up at him, doubt and hope warring in her expression. "You do that? For you?" Samuel said without hesitation. "Yes." A long silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Then Olivia took a deep breath and nodded. Okay. That was all he needed to hear. It was time to bring Nathan Caldwell down. And this time, Samuel Whitmore wasn't going to lose. Nathan Caldwell wasn't a fool. He had built his success on careful calculations, never taking a step without knowing where he would land. He had spent years crafting an image of power, of control, an untouchable force in the medical world, respected, feared, admired. And yet, as he sat in his office, staring at the document on his screen, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Fear. He clicked through the files Olivia had sent from an anonymous email. Financial records, fraudulent patient reports, evidence of illegal investments using hospital funds. It was all there, laid out in brutal clarity. It wasn't just damaging, it was career-ending, life-destroying. His hands curled into fists. She had turned against him. His jaw clenched as he forced himself to think. There had to be a way out of this. He had spent too long at the top to let one woman and a washed-up billionaire bring him down. He could make a deal, cover his tracks, twist the narrative. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "You're finished." Nathan's pulse spiked. He barely had time to process it before another notification appeared. Your resignation is the only way out. Take it, before it's too late. His stomach twisted as he looked out his office window. Somewhere, Samuel Whitmore was pulling the strings. And for the first time in his life, Nathan wasn't the one in control. Samuel stood in his study, his fingers wrapped tightly around his whiskey glass, though he hadn't taken a sip. He was watching his security feeds, waiting, expecting a reaction. Nathan had received the evidence. Samuel had made sure it landed directly in the inboxes of hospital board members, law enforcement, and several high-profile journalists. There was no escape for him now. But Samuel knew men like Nathan. Cornered animals didn't go down quietly. He heard footsteps behind him. Olivia stood in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself. Did he respond? Samuel nodded. Not directly, but he will. She swallowed hard, stepping further into the room. I didn't think I'd ever do this, she admitted. For so long, I convinced myself he was untouchable, that fighting back wasn't worth the risk. Samuel turned to her. And now, she met his gaze, something steady and fierce in her expression. Now, I want to watch him burn. Samuel felt something tighten in his chest. Admiration, pride, something deeper. He had always seen her strength, but now, for the first time, she saw it too. Before he could say anything, his phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. Caldwell. A long silence. Then, Nathan's voice, low and controlled. You think this is over? Samuel's grip on the phone tightened. It is. A cold chuckle. You're making a mistake. No, Samuel said, his tone absolute. You did. And now, you're going to pay for it. Nathan's breathing was heavy. You think she'll be safe with you? You think this ends with an email? Samuel's jaw locked. It ends with you losing everything. You don't own her. You never did. Another pause. Then Nathan's voice dropped to something darker. Maybe not. A beat of silence. Then, but I can still destroy you. The line clicked dead. Samuel's blood ran cold. It wasn't over. Olivia was in the kitchen when the security alarm blared. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she spun around. Samuel was already moving, his expression dark and focused as he checked the surveillance feed. Samuel cursed. He's here. She felt the room tilt. What? Samuel turned to her, calm but urgent. Stay behind me. The front doors burst open. Nathan stood there, shoulders tense, eyes wild. But he wasn't alone. Two security officers from the hospital flanked him, their expressions unreadable. Nathan, Samuel said, his voice low. Bad idea. Nathan's lips curled into something between a smirk and a snarl. You think I came here to beg? He gestured toward the men beside him. These gentlemen work for the board. They've been briefed on the situation. And guess what, Whitmore? They don't believe you. Olivia felt a chill run through her. Nathan still thought he could win. Samuel didn't flinch. You really think that? Nathan smirked. You sent out your little files, but you didn't account for one thing. His eyes flicked to Olivia. Loyalty. Samuel took a step forward. No one is loyal to you, Caldwell. Nathan shrugged, but his smile was slipping. I have powerful allies. Samuel pulled out his phone. And I have the press on speed dial. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Nathan's face. Samuel didn't stop. He pressed a button, activating the livestream function. Go ahead, Nathan. Explain to the world why you're here, breaking into my home, with hired muscle. Nathan's face paled. He hadn't expected this. Samuel's voice was deadly quiet. You're finished. The board will drop you. The police will arrest you. Your name will be ruined. Nathan's fingers twitched at his sides. For a brief second, he looked like he might lunge, might do something desperate. But then, the two men beside him stepped away. One of them pulled out a phone and murmured something into it. Samuel watched as Nathan realized what had happened. They weren't with him. They were here to arrest him. Nathan turned to run, but it was too late. The first officer grabbed his arm, forcing him down. Nathan fought, snarling, yelling, but within seconds, he was cuffed, his wrists bound behind him. Caldwell, you are under arrest for financial fraud, malpractice, and tampering with hospital records. Nathan's rage turned to panic. You think this will stop me? You think this will be the end of it? Samuel exhaled. Yeah, I do. Nathan struggled, his fury burning hot, but it was over. For the first time, Olivia breathed freely. Samuel turned to her, his expression unreadable. Are you okay? He asked. She let out a breath. And then, she smiled. I will be. Samuel stepped closer. He's gone. She looked up at him. And I'm still here. Something shifted between them. The weight of the past, the battle they had fought, it all led to this moment. Samuel reached for her, his fingers brushing against her cheek. You don't have to run anymore. She leaned into him, exhaling. And I don't want to. And when he kissed her, it wasn't desperate or reckless or uncertain. It was right. Because after everything, the fear, the pain, the fight, they had found their way to each other. And this time, there was nothing left to keep them apart. The nightmare was over. And their real life was just beginning.